He was never just a lover. He was the consequence of a violent family system finally coming home to collect. She believed she was hiring control, a polished stranger, a rented illusion, a way to survive humiliation. But in truth, she stepped into a machine built by generational cruelty where men confuse possession with love and power with protection. Her uncle raised a dynasty through manipulation. Matteo arrived as vengeance shaped into a man, and the tragedy is this. The woman they both tried to use became the only person who could expose them. This story is not about betrayal alone. It is about violence inheriting itself.
She was unaware of the psychological theater she had just entered. The strategy was rudimentary, a hired escort to serve as a human shield at the wedding of her cousin to her former lover. It was a simple, calculated defense meant to broadcast stability and manage the family's gaze. But the man who arrived was not the man she had chosen. Her critical failure, the point where the narrative twisted, was her inability to send him away. His sheer presence compelled her assent. The weight of his stare, the line of his shoulders, an unspoken certainty that short-circuited all deliberation. The agreement became a reflex, and only much later would the design of the trap be revealed. The man who was not her choice. A crisp contract folded in her pocket offered a tangible line of reasoning. The formal details, the letterhead, a subtle signature, a two-part payment with the first half already transferred, built a careful illusion of control. This was her counter-story, a direct rebuttal to the judgment of her family, which was the entire point. Amber light bled from the club's entrance as muffled music pushed against the glass. She smoothed her dress, steadied her breath, and adopted the posture her mother had named a queen's head, a heart of stone. But the saying was a mental construct, not a physical reality. Her emotional state was one of deep suppression, not absence. The catalyst had arrived 1 week ago, a cream-colored invitation bearing the initials G and C, Ginevra Ferrante and Connor Reed. His name sent her into a brief, dissociative fugue, leaving her on the floor for nearly 2 minutes before she reached for the futile comfort of wine. Connor Reed, her partner for 18 months, was marrying her cousin. The absence of sharp pain was, itself, a telling diagnosis. The real wound was chronic, a slow bleed caused by her uncle Augusto and her cousin's practiced aggressions, where their silence was the final verdict. She had been cast as the outside niece, daughter of the sister who defied the family, a brand that kept her perpetually off balance. Tonight she would project strength, not apology. The contract was her script for this performance. Scanning the room, she searched for her target. Dark hair, tall, gray suit named Felipe. A man at the bar seemed to match the description. It had to be him, but she had taken no more than 3 steps when he rose and turned, and the entire room collapsed into her periphery, leaving him as the only thing in focus. He commanded the space before he even moved, his suit the color of deep shadow. His eyes were already on her, a clear sign he knew where to find her. Her body froze, a reaction that had nothing to do with conscious thought. The operative in the dark suit closed the gap between them, tilted his head, and his low, resonant voice said, "Serena." It was a statement of fact, not a question. "Matteo Romano, I am your escort for the weekend." The agency sent a notification, Matteo stated, cutting off her question about Felipe, his tone ending the discussion. A last-minute switch. He conveyed this with such tranquil authority that she, for a moment, did not question the logic. Her phone was silent, buried in her purse alongside her dignity and her meticulously crafted plan. She had confirmed nothing. She might have demanded answers or canceled the whole affair, but she found she had no will to fight. For once, she wanted something to happen without a struggle. He was not the man she expected, but the pressures were immense. The wedding, an uncle who saw her as a dynastic error, a cousin marrying the man who had shared her bed for 18 months. She had no energy left to build a new plan. "Do you know the terms of the engagement?" she asked, her voice a strained imitation of command. Matteo Romano watched her with an unnerving placidity. "To accompany you to the wedding and ensure you receive no complaints, and to make my entire family believe that I am fine." "That too," he answered, his tone bordering on amusement. Her grip tightened on her purse. "Then let's go." The car was void of darkness and silence, scented with leather and an unplaceable fragrance that etched itself into her memory. Matteo drove with a single hand, his posture relaxed with the ease of a man who is used to being in control, not because he is untroubled, but because he has perfected concealing the signs. She fixed her gaze on the window, performing an indifference she did not feel. The drive to the Ferrante estate would be over an hour. For the first 20 minutes, she drowned herself in rationalization. It was a transaction. A contract existed. The man behind the wheel was not the specified vendor, but that did not change the function of the service. She repeated this like someone straightening pictures on a wall to avoid seeing the ruin on the floor. Service rendered, wedding endured, family managed. It was not simple, but it had to look that way. Her phone buzzed. It was Ela, her best friend, who had a singular talent for second-hand panic. "You got him? What's he like? Pick. Send one now." She risked a glance at Matteo. His eyes remained at the road, his face unreadable. "They made a substitution," she typed. "It's not the same guy." 3 dots pulsed for a painfully long time. "What do you mean it's not the same guy, Serena?" She put the phone away before her friend could make her laugh at the wrong time. "Big family?" Matteo asked, his voice cutting through the silence without preamble. The abrupt question startled her. It took her a second to reply. "The kind that replaces numbers with intensity." The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was the first crack in his stone-faced demeanor. "And the groom?" he asked, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "He is my ex." I let the words hang in the space between us. Matteo was quiet for a long beat. Then, "I see." "You don't have to see," I shot back. "You just have to look like you adore me." He flicked his eyes to me for 1 second, just one, then back to the road. "That won't be a problem," he said, and the way he said it stirred something deep in my stomach that I chose to willfully ignore. I watched Matteo Romano drive with that disquieting calm, his profile carved by the passing highway lights, and I decided that whatever had broken in my plan, the sheer disruption he would cause my family was worth every penny. The thing I had not yet begun to fathom, what would take me far too long to see, was that he knew who I was before I walked into that club, that the name Serena Ferrante was not new to him, that the substitution was not random, and that the man beside me knew exactly who I was, whose niece I was, and what he intended to do with that information. I stared out at the estate's approaching lights, feeling only the weight of the contract and the silent, radiating heat of a man too close, who breathed too slow and who I had just let into my life. Chapter 2. Arrival at the estate. Serena. Music. The Ferrante estate was the kind of place that wore its power quietly. The wrought iron gate swung open with a slow, deliberate grace, as if an arrival were a thing to be savored, and the long drive, lined with jacaranda trees, led the eye inevitably toward the main house. It was an expansive white structure with verandas on 2 floors and windows that glowed like watchful eyes. Horses grazed in a field to the left, while a garden to the right had been carefully cultivated for years to look effortlessly wild. I had known this view since I was 12 and had never shaken the visceral gut punch of arriving, the feeling that the grounds were too beautiful for someone who was never allowed to belong. Mateo's car glided to a halt at the main entrance, and before I could draw a single fortifying breath, he was beside my door, opening it with a seamless, practical motion, as if it were a task to be executed without thought. I accepted his hand and emerged, and it was then I saw them on the veranda. Aunt Rosanna was frozen, a glass of Prosecco paused halfway to her lips, her eyes flicking from me to Mateo and back again, with the frantic speed of a silent calculation. Next to her, Aunt Bettina clutched Cousin Lara's shoulder as if for physical support, while Lara's lips were parted in an expression of pure astonishment that, on any other day, I would have wanted to capture on film. A silent appraisal followed, lasting approximately 6 seconds, a period the subject registered as significant. The male escort, Mateo, then initiated contact, placing a hand on the small of her back with firm proprietary pressure. The unsolicited gesture established a non-verbal claim. The subject recorded a somatic response, a flush of heat that she noted was interfering with her rational thought. A voice, identified by its tone as Ginevra's, sliced through the tableau from the house just before she could move forward. Ginevra Ferrante stood framed in the doorway, her expression a wide, toothy smile, broadcasting her triumph. She offered a cursory hug, her gaze immediately shifting to analyze Mateo with overt scrutiny. Her verbal thrust, "And you brought a guest," was heavy with subtext. The subject's response was tonally flat. Mateo's introduction of himself was brief and devoid of any deferential posture. This denial of the expected social submission caused Ginevra's smile to tighten by a fraction, a micro-expression of her control being challenged. Ginevra's vanity fed on a diet of constant approval. This welcome dinner was her theater, a carefully constructed stage of false closeness. Low light bled across the table, designed to make everyone appear both more beautiful and more dangerous. I was trapped between Mateo and my Aunt Rosanna, whose clumsy 15-minute assault began immediately. Her question, "But where did you two meet?" was a poorly veiled trap to prove a theory she already held. My reply was a blade of 2 words, "At work." I cut her off with the short answer. A beat of silence fell as Rosanna waited for more, but I offered nothing. She pivoted, trying to pry information from Mateo, but he parried with a politeness so absolute it shut her down completely. From across the table, Connor Reed's practiced smile wavered, a mask slipping. He was handsome only from a distance. Up close, the illusion faded. Inside, I felt a familiar quiet where the hurt used to be. It's a place where a feeling for him lived. There was now only a quiet disconnect. I felt Connor's stare on me, clumsy and constant. Then Mateo's voice, a low murmur against my ear, a quiet diagnosis. "He doesn't look like a very focused groom." I said nothing, but felt a traitorous heat rise up my neck. My eyes locked onto my wineglass to escape. He leaned back, impassive, as I held the stare for 3 beats too long. Then, the patriarch arrived. Augusto Ferrante's entrance was a timed detonation designed to command the room's absolute focus. He wielded his own presence like a weapon. During the practiced hellos, his eyes found Mateo for a moment. Less than 2 seconds. It wasn't shock on his face, but the rapid calculus of a mind spotting an unknown variable and assessing its threat. Then he turned to me, Serena, his smile a perfect, hollow performance of family duty. Uncle Augusto, I returned, my tone as measured as his. His nod to Matteo was dismissive. I watched Matteo's face instead, a study in absolute stillness that told me everything. The dinner droned on, a cycle of old stories and practiced laughter. Then Augusto excused himself for more wine, a clear excuse to move toward the cellar. I saw Matteo's eyes follow him, a flicker so fast you'd doubt you saw it. The glance was so quick I almost thought I'd imagined it. Later, with an excuse of my own, I found them in a hallway. Augusto was circling, dropping casual questions about business, a predator testing a cage. Matteo stood like stone, his posture shut, giving away nothing, offering no polite entry. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Finally, Augusto conceded and walked away. Then Matteo turned, and his eyes met mine. He knew I'd seen it all. Not a word was said. His gaze was perfectly, impenetrably serene. In that moment, I knew this had become more than the arrangement we'd made. I looked away first, retreating to my seat. For the rest of the meal, I felt his eyes on me from the side, caught between wanting it to stop and not. Chapter 3. My growing feelings were a dangerous complication. In our room, I tried to reclaim power over the situation. You take the bed, I announced. I'll sleep on the sofa. Matteo walked in, his eyes sweeping the room in a quick, tactical survey. He gave a single-word reply. No. Then, more firmly, no, the bed is yours. His tone left no room for argument as he moved to check the closet. My prepared objections died on my lips, the battle lost before it began. Later, Isla would call his actions out of line for his job, dubbing it main character behavior. I tried to ground myself in the facts. He's hired. Service doesn't sleep on the sofa, she shot back. I ended the call, unwilling to face the thought she had planted. Life at the estate was a meticulously planned performance disguised as leisure. Matteo moved through this charade with an unnerving, seamless grace. He answered my family's questions with a perfect warmth that revealed nothing and stopped them from asking anything more. Without a single touch, he could make a whole room understand I was his. On the morning of day 2, the family arranged a paired horseback ride, their usual way of turning love into a contest. I rode beside Matteo through the orange grove. The long quiet was cut by his voice, a technical note aimed past the trees. That fence has a structural weakness, third post from the left. I looked. He was right. Do you know farms? Properties, he corrected, the word both an answer and a shield. Is there a real difference? The corner of his mouth lifted, the hint of a smile, not the smile itself. Marginally. His comment echoed in my head for the rest of the ride, yet I could make no sense of it. Isla was relentless on the phone. Okay, but are you two actually talking? Sometimes, I said. What does that mean, Serena? You know my real question. I did. That's why I shut the phone in a drawer and stared at the ceiling for 10 minutes, finally admitting something unplanned was happening. It was in the small things, the way he listened, not like hired help, but like an analyst collecting intelligence. How on the first morning he brought me black coffee, a preference I'd never shared. It was his hand on my arm, guiding me aside in the hall as Aunt Bettina passed with the tray. Just 2 seconds, his fingers on my elbow, a touch gone before I could process it, but my skin remembered. I diagnosed my own condition. I was in trouble. I knew it with the cold, frustrating certainty of logic applied to emotion. Connor found me on the 3rd afternoon. I was on the veranda reading the same page for the fourth time when he appeared with 2 lemonades and a smile I once thought could break me. Now, it was just an old song, overplayed and meaningless. "Can I join you?" he asked, already pulling up the chair. "You already are," I replied, not looking up from my book. He set a glass down beside me, then offered a rehearsed line. "You look well." "Thanks." "It's an observation, not a compliment." He paused. "You seem different." "I am different." I turned the page I hadn't read. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Who is he, Serena?" "My boyfriend," I said, the words as flat and factual as telling him the weather. A silence. "You never said you were seeing someone." "You never asked." I slowly closed the book and finally looked at him. A strange freedom washed over me, realizing his face now sparked nothing but a quiet tiredness. "And even if you had, Connor, you're getting married tomorrow. What difference would it have made?" He said nothing, just stared at the garden like a man arguing with his own reflection. I reopened the book to my impossible page, and we sat in that silence until he got up and left. Only when his steps faded did I see Matteo in the doorway. He stood with arms crossed, his face a mask, but I could feel his silent judgment of the entire scene. He didn't mention it. He just walked over, took the chair Connor had left, and after a quiet moment nodded to the drink. "Lemonade?" I glanced at the glass. "It can be thrown out." A flicker of something crossed Matteo's lips. "I thought you might say that." The third night was heavy and thick with heat. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as Matteo read on the sofa. The quiet wasn't empty. It was a living thing in the room. "Is this how you always are?" I asked the shadows above. A pause. "Define this." "Quiet, not needing to fill every second with noise." I heard his book shut. "Most people talk so they don't have to think," he replied. "I do the opposite." I turned my head off the pillow to look at him. He was lying on the sofa, one arm under his head, his gaze also fixed on the ceiling. Seeing this powerful, disciplined man folded onto a couch too small for him, a discomfort he never mentioned, sent a sharp pang through my chest that I refused to examine. "You don't have to sleep there," I said, cutting through my own thoughts. He turned his head, his eyes meeting mine for a beat too long to be casual, but not long enough to mean anything. "I know," he said, before looking back at the ceiling, perfectly still. I watched him for a dangerous moment, then returned to my own study of the dark. The hot night wore on, full of a thick, unspoken silence. The following afternoon, what almost happened on the second-floor veranda was entirely the fault of the atmosphere. Downstairs, the family played garden games. I had fled above for a sweater I didn't need, a ruse to escape Aunt Rosanna's circular questioning. Matteo's presence behind me was uninvited and silent. As I turned in the corridor, he was closer than expected. The hallway was tight, the late sun casting the kind of light that encourages bad choices. He didn't move back. Neither did I. We stood suspended in that moment for a length of time I cannot measure. The distance between us was the measure of a choice not yet made, his gaze holding mine with a quiet intensity that unraveled me with an efficiency I was beginning to resent. Then, as punctual as fate, the aunt's footsteps sounded on the stairs. I flinched back. He held his ground for a heartbeat as if weighing the interruption, before moving off with a calm that settled nothing. Downstairs, clutching the useless sweater, I stared blindly at the lawn game. Aunt Rosanna spoke of teams. Ginevra laughed at something Connor said. The sunset was a beautiful painting. utterly indifferent to my internal chaos. Later, lying awake in the dark to the sound of Mateo's breathing, I finally admitted that for 3 hours I had wished the aunts had never come. Upstairs, across the room, Mateo Romano was also awake until dawn, but that was information I did not yet possess. One day before the wedding, the subject was already compromised. The house thrummed with a tension the Ferrante family called excitement. Flowers delivered, caterers moved with purpose, and the aunts swept through the halls with the force of a storm, completing 10 tasks at once. I hid in the library. It was a flawed sanctuary, a cramped room with aged shelves and a chair smelling of distinguished decay. But it was the only place I had been left alone for 2 days, and I desperately needed 15 minutes without someone asking if I was fine with a tone that knew I was not. The door swung open without a warning knock. Connor Reed entered, his shoulders set in a pose of rehearsed sorrow, and shut the door with a gentleness that infuriated me before a word was spoken. "I had to get you alone," he said. "I had to get silence," I answered, my gaze fixed on the garden. "Then one of us is about to be disappointed." He came to the window, invading my space with a deliberate nearness meant to convey the weight of his presence. "Serena." His voice was low, tuned to the frequency of manufactured sincerity. "I made a mistake. With you, with everything, and I have no right to say this now, the night before my wedding. But if I don't speak, I'll actually get married." I finally turned to him. "You are marrying my cousin tomorrow, Connor. That was decided long before you walked in here." His pupils widened, the look of a man expecting to find a wound and encountering only scar tissue. "I'm still in love with you," he insisted, a declaration that might have worked on a previous version of me. But I felt nothing inside, only a clinical stillness, like pressing on an old injury to find it has completely vanished. My reaction wasn't pain or rage or any feeling worthy of the drama. Instead, a cold, sharp clarity settled in, the kind that arrives when you stop fighting a truth you already know. "You don't love me," I said, my voice flat, like I was correcting a typo. "You fear the wedding, and I'm a familiar escape hatch. That's not love." His mouth opened, then closed. "You need to go, Connor." I looked back at the window, my resolve set on being at the altar tomorrow. I registered his footsteps fading, the click of the door, and watched the garden, sensing that my last tie to the past had just been severed without a sound. The space he left wasn't empty, but something warmer and less distinct, personified by the man in the dark suit who slept on the sofa and had kept watch all night, a fact unknown to me. The previous evening's dinner was a scene of tall candles, barely touched food, and conversation intended to fill the silences. I wore a wine-colored dress I kept for such occasions, a garment that says nothing but makes you look twice. As I came down the stairs, Mateo's only reaction was to halt his conversation with Raphael, the new mysterious arrival, and become perfectly still for a single charged second. I mentally cataloged that second. At the table, Mateo sat beside me as arranged, the dinner unfolding with its familiar rhythms. Aunt Rosanna made attempts at conversation, Augusto watched with a calculating eye, and Ginevra glowed with the certainty of being tomorrow's star. Connor was seated opposite me. He was watching me with an intensity he'd once learned to hide and had since forgotten how. Mateo noticed. I knew because his stillness shifted. It was no longer the appreciative pause from the stairs, but a denser, more contained quiet that comes before an action. He then angled his body toward mine. The motion was slow enough that I felt the shift in proximity before he made contact, his shoulder drawing near, his arm brushing mine, his mouth approaching my ear. The closeness short-circuited my thoughts. "Look at me," he murmured, his voice a low command meant only for me. I turned my face to his, and all distance was gone. The professional boundary we were supposed to have had evaporated. There was just his face, his dark eyes unreadable as the noise of the dinner party faded into the background. He brought his hand to my face deliberately, his fingers grazing my chin in a light inquiry before he kissed me. It was not a hesitant kiss. It was not a performance to maintain our cover. It was a slow, measured heat that slipped past my defenses and found a weakness I never knew I possessed. I felt the table's chatter die in a wave of silence that spread from person to person, but I didn't care. There was a hand on my jaw, a mouth on mine, and a fire in my chest that had no right to be there, yet burned with absolute certainty. He pulled back with the same steady control, leaving me staring at him for a beat, my expression unformed, before my eyes swept the table to find Connor's chair empty. No one was looking at the door. He had already walked through it. Everyone else was looking at us. The aunt seemed to have stopped breathing. Augusta's gaze was locked on Matteo, an expression I couldn't place but filed away to analyze later. Ginevra's bright smile had shrunk by an infinitesimal measure. With a calm that felt like a personal insult, Matteo raised his wine glass and took a sip as if nothing had happened. I went upstairs before the meal ended. I didn't say a word to him. There was nothing to say or too much, which was the same thing. I shut the door to our room, sat on the bed, and stared at my hands for a long time, trying to find order in the chaos. Kissing me was a tactic to get rid of Connor, a calculated move, a function of his job. It was exactly what a man hired for this role would do. That was the logical sequence. The problem was that my body registered the act as something other than a performance, a debate I was not equipped to have with myself. It was also the most unsettling kiss I had known in years, creating a problem on a scale I could not begin to solve that night. A knock came at the door 20 minutes later, 3 unhurried taps. I opened it. Matteo was there, jacket gone, the top button of his shirt undone. The change was subtle. He was not less imposing, just one layer closer to the world. We watched each other for a long second, filled with heat and meaning, before I stepped aside. He came in, and I shut the door behind him. When I turned, he was standing too close for any pretense to survive. "The kiss was not in the contract," I managed, my voice less steady than I wanted. "It wasn't," he agreed. "Then you had no business doing it." "Probably not." He didn't yield an inch as he spoke, and I held my ground. A strange energy crackled between us, not just desire, not just conflict, but both compressed into a space too small to contain them. "You kissed me in front of everyone," I said, the words both an accusation and a question. "Yes." His voice was a low murmur, calculated. He angled his head, a subtle shift that erased the last fraction of distance between us, a space I felt rather than saw. "Serena," he said, and my name from his lips was a deliberate choice, not protocol, carrying a weight it never had before. That was for them. This is for me. I drew a breath to offer a rebuttal. I had one sharp and ready, a valid point, and then his mouth was on mine, a slow, deep hunger that silenced it. The kiss was a rising tide of heat, our tongues meeting in an intimate rhythm, a question and an answer. His hand moved to my waist, slipping beneath my blouse to warm my skin. I breathed out against his mouth, as my body answered his touch. He guided me back to the wall with a deliberate gentleness, his hard frame pressing against me. I felt the sharp ridge of his arousal as my fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt, freeing the heat from his chest. My hands traced the firm lines of his abdomen down to the waistband of his trousers. He let out a soft hiss of breath as my hand enclosed him, his pulse a frantic beat in my palm. With measured grace, he lifted my skirt, his fingers finding the center of my heat. They entered me slowly, curving with an expert's precision as his thumb moved in slow, perfect circles. A shiver took me, stealing my breath as my hands clenched his shoulders, and then he lifted me. My legs wrapped around his waist, a pure, thoughtless instinct. In one fluid, penetrating motion, he was inside me, filling me with a pleasant, stretching ache. Our bodies found a desperate, synchronized cadence. Each thrust drove us deeper into the spiraling sensation. The pleasure built an unstoppable wave. When the climax came, it was a cataclysm. I came apart around him in long, shuddering waves, crying his name against his throat. He followed moments later, his release a series of hot, violent spasms, his entire body trembling against mine. For a long time, the lamp cast a golden light on our slick, tangled bodies. Only much later did the hot, silent night of the sleeping estate finally claim us. Chapter 5, the wedding, the morning after, everything that changed. I awoke to a high sun, the right side of the bed empty and cool, a sign he had been gone for some time. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like 2 minutes, caught in that strange peace that follows a seismic event, before the body decides how it feels. There was no regret. I had searched for it, carefully tracing the emotion's edge for any familiar sting. There was nothing, just a faint, dizzying lightness and the scent of his cologne on the other pillow, a detail I would keep for myself, especially from Ela. Mateo was on the veranda with a coffee cup, his back to me, watching the staff in the garden arrange the last of the chairs for the ceremony. He heard my footsteps and turned his head, though not his body, his eyes studying me for a moment with a look both calmer and more open than before. Then his gaze returned to the garden. "There's coffee," he said. I took the seat beside him, and we fell into a quiet that was different from all our other silences. It held no agenda, no negotiation. It was just two people in a garden at dawn, and something about that starkness felt, for reasons I was not ready to inspect, more deeply intimate than the night we had just shared. The ceremony was at noon, under an arch of white flowers that had taken hours of careful work to create. Ginevra appeared at the makeshift aisle, her lace dress an object of pure beauty, her smile undeniably real. Watching her, I felt only the detached relief of someone who had narrowly escaped a fate never meant for them. Connor stood at the altar, looking like a man doing the right thing without fully understanding why. And as Ginevra reached him and he took her hands, his eyes dropped to the ground for a second before meeting hers. Just a second, but I saw it. And Mateo beside me, his arm a light pressure against mine, saw it too and said nothing, which was the only right response. When the officiant pronounced them married and the crowd applauded, Mateo leaned close and murmured very low, "There, you've survived it." I turned my head toward him, my eyes narrowing slightly. "I was never the one in danger." "I know," he said, with that calm tone that could mean agreement or something else entirely. "The question was whether they would survive you." I held his gaze for a moment, unable to form a response. Then the music started and people began to stand and the moment was lost, but I filed it away like something fragile and rare. We left before the party was over. No words were needed. At one point, our eyes met across the room with an understanding that made language obsolete, and 15 minutes later we were in the car driving back, the music low, the Ferrante estate shrinking in the rearview mirror. That next week was the strangest and most peaceful I had known in a very long time. We stayed in the city. He had an apartment with high ceilings, minimal furniture, and books in unexpected places, arranged with the private logic of a person who reads constantly and cares little for appearances. It was a space that revealed things about him without meaning to, and I moved through it like someone learning a new language. We cooked together once. He knew his way around a kitchen with the infuriating competence of a man who does things well without fuss, and I chopped an onion wrong. He corrected it without comment, his hand closing over mine to adjust my grip in a gesture that lasted 3 seconds and made me ruin the next slice in a new way entirely. "You did that on purpose," I said. "I was fixing your technique," he replied, his voice perfectly even. "With your hand, it's the most effective method." I looked at him. He was studying the cutting board with an expression that gave nothing away, one I was already learning to read as controlled amusement, and I turned back to the stove before I said something he could use. We had an agreement spoken out loud and confirmed by 2 people who believed their own words in that moment. For thus, the length of the contract only, no attachments, no complications, no expectations past the end date. It was rational. It was adult. It was exactly the kind of arrangement 2 intelligent people could navigate without getting hurt. I found myself revisiting that logic with increasing frequency that week, a fact I chose to ignore. After I had left his apartment, the intercom buzzed. Matteo answered to the concierge's voice, announcing 2 men were downstairs with a message from Mr. Ferrante. This wasn't a friendly visit. The concierge's voice had the strained quality of a man who had already figured that out and wasn't sure what to do next. "Send them up," Matteo said. The 2 men were the type who didn't need to announce their purpose. The way they entered a room did it for them. They stood just inside the door, side by side, with the stillness of men trained to own a space without overt aggression, which was its own kind of threat. The older of the 2 spoke. The message was short, delivered with a rehearsed informality that felt colder than any threat. Mr. Augusto Ferrante wanted to settle the business between them before the Christmas holiday. An offer was extended, a fair financial package for the inconvenience of the past few years, with a single condition attached. Matteo Romano was to break all contact with the niece and make sure the split was permanent. Matteo said nothing for a long moment after the man finished. He stood in the middle of the room, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable, holding a silence that forces lesser men to speak. The older man was not a lesser man. He waited. "Tell Mr. Ferrante," Matteo said at last, his voice low and completely flat, "that I received the message." The man had expected more. Nothing else came. "Is that all?" he asked, raising a single eyebrow. "For now," Matteo answered. The 2 men traded a brief glance, the kind people use when they don't want to be seen communicating, and left without another word. The door clicked shut, and the apartment was silent again, but the silence had changed, becoming heavier, sharper. Matteo went to the window, watching the city lights for a time that was not contemplative. He was processing a purely internal act that appeared on the outside as only a stillness deeper than usual. Augusto had used Serena as a bargaining piece. He had put her name into a negotiation, like a transactional figure, not a human being, and had done it with the ease of a man who has operated that way for so long, who had seen his niece as a movable asset for so many years, that he no longer recognized he was doing it. Matteo knew that history. He had done his research on Serena before the club, had studied the Ferrante family dynamics enough to understand her position within it, or more accurately, her lack of one. The peripheral niece, daughter of the sister who made a mistake, a name on official records but never in a strategic meeting. No dossier could have prepared him for the sheer fact of her presence, the way she held her ground as the world fell away beneath her feet, the wit she used as a shield, which was somehow the truest part of her, the clean finality of her dismissal of Connor on the terrace, not with drama, but like shutting a window against a storm. He'd walked into that club with a flawless plan, every piece in place, yet somewhere between the purple blaze of the jacarandas and a kitchen knife on a Tuesday, the logic held, but the mission was lost. His phone buzzed. It was Raphael, his shadow, tracking Augusto's men as they left the vehicle below. Two departed, no trouble. Ferrante is pushing, Matteo texted back. I know. We handle this at dawn. Chapter 6. She was playing too, but it was not a game. The summons from Augusto came on Christmas Eve morning, his voice stripped of the hollow warmth he performed annually as the attentive uncle. It was another tone, lower and flatter, the sound he used to manage a crisis while pretending it was just a talk. He had to see me, he said, about something vital I must learn before the party, something concerning my companion. I chose a cafe on the main road, needing neutral territory over the estate, arriving ahead of time to sit, order a coffee to go cold, and compose my face into a mask that would reveal nothing until I understood his play. Augusto entered in his gray overcoat with the promptness he wore like a virtue, claimed the opposing seat, and cut through the pleasantries. This man you're seeing, he opened as if naming an unresolved complication, is not the person you imagine him to be. I waited. Matteo Romano. He let the name lie on the table, its weight intended to be enough. Do you grasp the meaning of that name? You're going to tell me, I said. And he did, with the precision of an assassin briefing his target. He described the organization, its vast scale, the layered businesses, and the reputation that, while unwritten, was understood by everyone in a certain world. He spoke of danger and entanglement, repeating, "You have no idea what you are getting into," as if saying it more made it true. I listened as my coffee grew cold, my heart beginning a low, steady beat that was the sound of the world tilting on its axis. Because the man Augusto sketched was not at odds with the one I knew. In truth, it was the only portrait of him that made sense of all the details I'd collected and could never quite fit together. The calm that was not learned, but born in him. The way my uncle's face had changed at that very first dinner. Her entire world suddenly violently reconfigured as scattered facts. Raphael's fleeting visits, the men on Christmas Eve, snapped into a single terrifying picture. Still, a memory resisted the new truth, a feeling rooted in a moment of closeness with Romano, a hand covering hers, a smile that was never for anyone else. This fragment of warmth fought against the cold reality with the fierce denial of a dawning trauma. Augusto watched her, expecting the usual shock. After a long beat, her reply landed with an icy calm. I know. He blinked. What? he asked. That I knew the whole story. Her eyes never left his. From the very start. A brief, unguarded shock flashed across Augusto's features before he buried it. Are you saying you knew who he was when... I am saying, she cut in, her voice a blade of serenity, that you've told me nothing that wasn't already my concern. He paused, studying her calm facade, knowing it was a lie that hid a war within. He shifted slightly in his seat, a familiar tell that he was changing tactics. Very well, he said, his voice feigning admiration. It seems your perception is sharper than I estimated. A beat of silence, which means you'll appreciate my offer. He laid it on the table. Control of Romano and Associates, he specified. Total operational command, a share in the profits, and freedom my own daughters will never see. He inclined his head. Everything you always knew you deserved, and everything I kept from you on purpose, Serena? The last part was a truth deployed not for kindness, but for effect. The cost, she said, knowing their entire relationship was a transaction. There was always a cost. You walk away from Romano, permanently. She met his stare for a long moment, then asked with stark simplicity, Why do you want this so badly? He started his prepared speech. As I said, Romano is a threat and you... No. She set her cup down. This isn't some uncle trying to protect his niece. You call me once a year on Christmas. You are not here for my sake. She mimicked the tilt of his head. What of yours does he have? The silence that followed was a louder confession than any words could be, lasting just long enough for her to know she had hit the mark. You're asking questions with no answers, Augusto said, all warmth gone from his voice. Or I am asking the only one that counts. She stood, took her purse, and looked at him one final time with the terrible clarity of someone who finally understands. I'll think about your offer. She left without waiting for his answer, the cold air outside a shock to her senses. She went to Matteo's building, a knot of something close to terror tightening in her gut. She rapped on his door 3 times, harder than she'd intended. He opened it, reading her face in an instant before she could speak, and simply moved aside to let her in. My uncle just told me who you are, she said, stopping in the middle of the room. I need your side of it. Matteo watched her with the stillness that no longer felt like distance, but like a man preparing to tell a hard truth without varnish. And so he began. He detailed Augusto's methodical destruction, contracts suddenly voided, suppliers pressured into backing out, investments rerouted to erase 2 years of his work. His voice was clinical, a list of facts that needed no emotion to land with devastating force, and she drank in every word with a focus that was its own kind of pain. Then he came to the night at the club. I knew who you were before you walked in, he said, his gaze locked with hers. I sent the escort away. I took his place because you were the fastest way to get to Augusto without him knowing. The silence that fell was like shattered glass. She got up from the couch, a piece of furniture she didn't remember sitting on, and went to the window, needing space to think. The introduction, the hand at her waist, every memory was now tainted with a new, colder meaning. You used me, she said to her reflection in the glass. That was the plan, he answered with that same raw honesty, offering no excuse to soften the blow. She stood there in a silence he had already learned was hers to break. She picked up her purse and walked to the door, then stopped, her hand on the knob. She stood processing the white-hot anger and below it, a deeper ache. the psychic wound left by Augusto Ferrante in 30 years of his polite, condescending erasure. That man had summoned her to be a bargaining chip for the second time in her life. He had dangled a stolen inheritance as a prize and demanded her loyalty for it. Slowly, she turned to face Matteo. He hadn't moved, his quiet gaze offering no comfort, which was strangely the only true thing between them in that moment. "The safe," she said, "in his office at the estate. Ginevra let the combination slip years ago. It's the birthdays of his daughters." She paused. "And I have an idea of what Augusto hides in it, or at least that it's something he never once found." She met his gaze. "You want your revenge. I want him to answer for my entire life." She let go of the door. "So, we make a plan." Matteo studied her for a moment, and for the first time she'd seen it, a brief, genuine shock crossed his face. Then, the corner of his lip twitched in a way she was just beginning to understand. "It's all right," he conceded, "but I need every detail of what he said." Her purse fell onto the sofa as she sat, and a measure of warmth finally seeped into the frigid Christmas Eve apartment. For the first time, they were on the same side of this fight. Chapter 7: The Vault, the Code, the Holiday Turned Operation. She wore a red dress to the Ferrante Christmas party, a gift from her mother dormant for years because no event ever felt grand enough. That night she wore it like armor. Matteo's gaze held hers for a beat that had shattered her composure too many times before. Then he murmured, "You're ready?" It was a statement. "I am," she affirmed, with a conviction that had eluded her for most of her life. He offered his arm, she took it, and they stepped into the Ferrante house for her 12th Christmas there, but the first with a defined mission. The party was a familiar stagecraft of family tradition. A tree stood in the foyer amid ambient music and untouched food platters, all props in a theater of surveillance. Ants patrolled in pairs, armed with champagne and observant glares. Ginevra was there with Connor, her new husband, both still performing the practiced smiles of newlyweds for the camera. In the main room, Augusto was the predictable center of gravity for a cluster of older men listening with rapt attention. He noticed her entrance, delivered a perfunctory kiss to her forehead, and his eyes darted to Matteo for a split second before returning to her, a smile that failed to light his eyes. "Serena, good to see you." "Wouldn't dream of missing it," she returned with equal insincerity, then moved to retrieve a glass of champagne she would not touch. Outside, Raphael Conte monitored a property map on a phone from a parallel street with two men. Matteo had laid out the plan with the precision of one who knows battles are won in the details. Raphael controlled the side exit. Another man covered the office hallway. A third kept the car running. My objective: infiltrate, crack the safe, and extract the package. The plan was deceptively simple, a deliberate balm for the anxiety we both knew I felt. For 40 minutes I performed. I feigned interest in Aunt Rosanna's catering talk, nodded through Ginevra's honeymoon monologue, and tracked Augusto's movements. A slow, proprietary stride that belonged to a man certain of his dominance. For the initial 20 minutes, Matteo's presence was a grounding force, until he drifted into Augusto's circle with practiced nonchalance. That, I understood, was the diversion. With my uncle's attention now fixed on Matteo Romano, my window opened. I slipped down the corridor, feigning a trip to the restroom. Augusto's office, behind its dark wooden door, was a symbol of my childhood exclusion, the room where conversations would die the moment I appeared. With a steady hand, I crossed the threshold, closing the door behind me without a sound. The office smelled of old paper, wood polish, and the phantom of a cigar smoked by a man who manages his vices with surgical control. A heavy desk dominated the space, surrounded by shelves, and the safe was hidden behind a painting I had first noticed at age 14. I remembered barging in that day and seeing an expression on Augusto's face that was unreadable then, but transparent now. I lifted the painting away. The safe was a compact gray box with a keypad. Ginevra's voice from years past came back to me, a careless comment turned critical key. My father is a creature of routine. Do you know he uses his daughter's birthdays for every password? It's so utterly predictable. I could almost hear her laugh, a piece of trivia I'd stored for no reason. I typed in Ginevra's birth date. Denied. I took a calming breath and entered Lara's. A sharp click echoed in the silence as the lock gave way. Inside lay a thick envelope, financial files, and a small black memory stick. For a beat, too long for prudence but vital, I stared at the items, feeling the gravity of a history that predated me. Then, on autopilot, I gathered everything and shut the safe. In that instant, I heard footsteps in the hall. The rhythm was not of a lost guest, but of someone with a clear destination. I had no time to rehang the painting. Augusto entered, his expression confirming the suspicion that had shadowed him all evening. He moved methodically, locked the door, registered the bare wall, and noted my purse. Only then did he open the desk drawer and retrieve a small black pistol with the familiarity that screamed of contingency, not impulse. Serena. His voice was utterly calm, far more chilling than rage. Uncle Augusto, I replied, matching his tone. You have no idea what you are doing, he said, a last offer of paternalistic mercy. I know exactly what I'm doing, I countered, my voice firm, despite the adrenaline storm inside me. You're protecting a man who played you. He took one slow step forward. He came into your life with a purpose and will discard you when it's served. Or, I retorted, standing my ground, I'm finally protecting myself from you, which I should have done a long time ago. Augusto's composure finally fractured. I was the one element he hadn't factored in. For a second, the patriarch vanished, and I saw a man realizing he had fatally underestimated his quiet niece, but far too late. He raised the gun, and time dilated. Every detail came into sharp relief. The lamplight, the scent of cigars, the muffled sounds of the party from another world. It was me against my uncle, 30 years of feeling insignificant compressed into a single, crystalline moment of truth. The door opened. Matteo Romano entered with an authority that needed no introduction, followed by two men whose role was self-evident. In the hall, Rafael Conte lowered his phone, his face confirming our success. Augusto was frozen with the gun raised, his eyes locked on Matteo, his mind racing through a new losing equation. Matteo strode across the room and stood between us, a deliberate, silent declaration of protection. He never looked at the gun. His gaze stayed on Augusto, a projection of pure calm that I now saw as the ultimate form of power, something innate, not performed. You know who I am, Matteo stated, his voice low and absolute. And you know what is in her purse if you choose the wrong way out of this room. Augusto was rigid. Lower the weapon, Augusto. It was not a request. It was a statement of inevitable fact. A 3-second silence passed before the gun came down. Matteo's stance did not change. There was no relief, only the quiet confirmation of a predicted outcome. He glanced at me, a silent question about my state. I gave a slight nod. I was fine. His focus returned to Augusto, his expression now that of a man with business to settle, starting immediately. I leaned on a bookshelf, taking my first real breath in what felt like hours, my heart still racing. I saw my uncle across the room, smaller, older, and exposed, and felt not victory, but the profound quiet of a story reaching its final page. In that office, on that night, Matteo Romano owned the situation, a fact Augusto Ferrante had accepted too late to change anything. Chapter 8. Contract Termination. Matteo's men restrained Augusto with a silent professionalism that rendered drama unnecessary. There was no shouting, no chaos, no hint of the confrontation to disturb the oblivious festivities outside. My uncle sat bound in his own chair, his eyes still calculating, always calculating. Matteo stood before the desk, weaponizing the silence before he spoke. The terms were delivered with the cold finality of a verdict. A set of conditions without recourse. He explained that the documents I held were enough to destroy Augusto's reputation across multiple industries and nations. All assets taken over the past 3 years would be returned. Restitution would be paid on a non-negotiable schedule. And finally, Augusto Ferrante would cease using the Romano name forever. A public admission of defeat and the loss of his fortune. After Matteo's words fell, a long silence stretched taut in the room before her uncle's gaze shifted, landing on her. A new expression claimed his features, one so foreign it took a beat for her to name it. It was the look of a man watching a world he'd built himself finally crumble to dust. She said nothing. Words were useless now, burned to ash by the revelations of the last 15 minutes. She hugged the portfolio to her chest, her eyes locked on his, a silent promise of ruin delivered before she turned away, closing the scene on her own terms. As Raphael entered to deal with the aftermath, she slipped into the hallway. Her walk was steady, a lie her trembling knees almost exposed, the aftershock of a battle won. Matteo found her moments later by a window framing the garden party below, the distant lights and music a world away from the wreckage just 20 meters behind them. They stood in silence, watching, before she held out the portfolio. "This is yours." He took it, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, after a pause, he reached into his pocket and produced a single document folded 4 times that she knew instantly. It was their first contract, the ink of her signature still sharp on the original page. He'd bought a controlling share of the agency just 2 days after they met. A silent, calculated move to control her file. She wasn't sure if the revelation should infuriate her more or less. He offered the paper without a word. She took it, her eyes tracing the familiar slant of her own writing, the date, the cold numbers that had once felt like salvation. The whole thing felt like an artifact from another woman's life, a relic from a time before everything changed. She tore the contract. The sound of the paper ripping was sharp and clean, a satisfying finality that could never be undone. As she cupped the pieces in her hand, she watched Matteo produce his own copy, a detail she filed away for later. He destroyed his with the same precise, lethal grace he did everything. They stood there, holding the ruins of their agreement, wrapped in a silence deeper and heavier than any before. And then a laugh escaped her, unplanned and raw. It was the sound of a dam breaking, a sudden, wild release. It was a laugh born of relief, and the sheer absurdity of it all. Standing in a hallway at Christmas, holding confetti made of their own lies. Matteo watched her, and then he laughed too. Not a smirk or a careful smile, but a real, unrestrained laugh that went on too long. It reshaped his face in a way she couldn't name, but watched with rapt attention, knowing she was seeing something rare. And in that moment, a terrible, perfect clarity struck her. She was in deep, a truth she had denied for so long. The contract had just been a flimsy shield, a well-intentioned folly. His laughter faded first, but the openness on his face lingered, a layer of armor stripped away. "You could have left," he said, his voice low. "When I opened the door, you had what you came for. You could have been gone." "I know," she admitted, "but you were still there. I was still there." He studied her with that unnerving stillness of his, then lifted a hand. He slowly tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, the touch less a caress and more a final verification, as if the contact itself was sealing a choice. His hand rested against her cheek, and for once there was no strategy in the touch. No audience, no performance, just the hallway, a dark window, and the pieces of their old deal on the floor. "The arrangement is over," he murmured, his voice sinking lower. "It's over," she confirmed. "What happens now?" he asked. The question was real, stripped of all certainty. The man who controlled every variable was handing one over to her. She looked at him, at the face she had learned to read, and the eyes that had found her in that club and never once looked away. "Whatever comes next," she answered, "but this time no contract." The edge of his mouth curved up, and she let her own smile answer. Outside, the Ferrante party went on. Rafael Conte was probably making a dry comment to himself, and Christmas continued. None of it mattered as much as the soft click of a door down the hall and the silence that came after. Chapter 9. Unforeseen Contractual Variables. 2 months after Christmas, Mateo's apartment had become theirs without a single discussion. Her life moved in piece by piece, a toothbrush, a coat left on purpose, then a drawer, then half a closet he'd cleared out as if waiting for something meant to be there. The time after the estate was not easy. Neither of them had promised it would be. Some days he retreated behind walls she was learning not to take personally. Some days she was so lost in her own head he had to say her name twice. Fights would start over nothing and end 20 minutes later on the real buried truth, concluding when one of them chose to yield, a move of strength, not surrender. But there were the constants, coffee made just right every morning, long silences reading in the same room, and a hand on her back, a simple touch that said only, "I'm here." One February night she asked the darkness, "Do you regret how we started?" His hand was on her back, tracing slow, absent circles. "No," he answered softly. "But if I could do it again, I would have done it differently." "How?" "I would have told you the truth at the club." She pictured it. Matteo Romano telling her everything in that bar. She would have run. She would have called Isabella in a panic and never looked back. "I wouldn't have stayed," she thought. "I know." His hand never stopped moving. "That's why I didn't." In the dark, she understood the difference between acceptance and forgiveness. She'd accepted him first, over quiet mornings and shared books. Forgiveness came later, not as a choice, but as a slow, quiet fading of her anger until something real and solid stood in its place. The documents from Augusto's safe were somewhere else now, a place Raphael chose that she didn't know. Matteo said the analysis would take time, and she found herself able to let it go, trusting him to handle it. She buried the thought of the papers, pushing it down in favor of the here and now. The quiet of their apartment, the weight of Matteo beside her, was enough to silence the constant alarm bell in her mind. She thought of their beginning, A cold, calculated contract that had somehow melted and reforged itself into this need. A deal for leverage had become a bond neither could name, born from shared wounds and secrets. She closed her eyes, a deliberate act of denial as the peace was broken. Mateo's phone buzzed on the nightstand, Raphael's name lighting up the screen, and she ignored it. Mateo didn't move beside her, and his stillness was a conspiracy, a silent agreement to pretend this wasn't happening. She didn't check to see if he was truly asleep. She didn't want to know. Instead, she chased the darkness, trying to fall back into a dream, desperate to hold on to their perfect, fragile silence. End of part 1. For 23 years, her entire life was a story built on one foundational lie about the mother who left. A fiction she accepted at age 7. A 3-page file was all it took to burn that story to the ground. The file's contents remade her past and her sense of self. But the deepest wound was not the revelation itself. It was the look in Mateo's eyes. A look that confirmed he had known all along and had chosen to hide it. This concludes the initial file. Book 2 has been compiled. The remainder of this chronicle is held behind a veil, accessible for a price. For 23 years, her world was built on a flawed truth concerning her mother, a lie that seeded a profound inadequacy in her soul. This conviction, formed at the tender age of 7, was never questioned until a 3-page folder shattered her reality. Its contents redrew the map of her identity and the genesis of her family's ruin. The final sharpest wound was delivered by the look in Mateo's eyes, a silent confession of his part in it all. This is the prelude to the second act. The complete, uncensored file is waiting. Follow the primary link in the pinned comment where the narrative continues without pause. That link is your direct access to the full, unbroken second volume. The creation of this next piece is proving fertile, with more chapters already taking shape. This archive is a sanctuary for the more harrowing case studies, the true dark romances. The material is too psychologically volatile for public view, so this private space allows me to present my work to you, unfiltered. Be warned, our primary outlet has been silenced. This new refuge is a means to support the research team and ensure these deep analyses can continue. Updates on our methods will follow. I will meet you at the first link in the pinned commentary. Regrettably, the theft of our audio recordings and the complete narrative has become a rampant issue, with our work appearing on other platforms without consent.
From a distance, her story appears to be about romance wrapped inside danger, but that reading is too shallow. What she was truly pursuing was not love, it was recognition. She wanted to be seen, not by a lover, but by a family structure that had trained her to feel peripheral. The wedding merely concentrated years of exclusion into one ceremonial wound. In this sense, the event functioned like a stage where an old emotional economy was exposed. Her family had long treated belonging as something conditional, something earned through posture, silence, and strategic usefulness. She learned early that affection could be withheld, that dignity could be negotiated, and that survival often required performance. So when she hired a man to stand beside her, she was not simply making a social move, she was constructing an argument. She was saying, in the only language power understands, look again, I am not disposable. But there is tragedy in that gesture. She still walked into the room seeking a verdict. That is what makes her transformation meaningful. She began the story trying to control the image others had of her, yet she ended it confronting the deeper wound beneath that impulse, the hunger to be chosen by people who built their authority on withholding. The family patriarch believed control was inheritance. He mistook exclusion for discipline. He mistook fear for order. Yet systems like his always plant the seeds of their own collapse, because every slight, every calculated silence, every act of emotional rationing becomes water for future defiance. She eventually understood that she had not been difficult to love. She had simply been placed inside a structure that confused hierarchy with intimacy. Once she saw that, the architecture of shame began to crack. The lesson here is profound. A person can spend years trying to become acceptable to a room that profits from her insecurity. But healing begins when she questions the room itself. Not every rejection is proof of inadequacy. Sometimes it is evidence that the system rejecting her is built on moral poverty. She did not find freedom when others finally understood her value. She found it when their misunderstanding stopped defining it.